How did Land Headquarters, the Director of Military Training, the divisions, the brigades, and individual battalions ready themselves for combat in the jungle? We look at the roadblocks to the lessons learnt process in the Southwest Pacific in 1942-43.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 120 of the Principles of War podcast, Preparing Soldiers for Jungle Warfare. This is the third episode in our series of interviews with Dr. Adrian Threlfall. He is the author of Jungle Warriors and an expert in jungle warfare doctrine development. As you listen to this episode today, there's two things I want you to think about. Firstly, as early as 1930, it shouldn't have come as any surprise that Australia may be fighting the Japanese. If you look between Australia and Japan, there is a lot of jungle, and yet nothing had been done prior to the start of the Second World War, and indeed, very little had been done prior to the commencement of hostilities between Japan and Australia. Secondly, this interview is going to look at many of the bottlenecks that impeded the lessons learnt process, the doctrine development, and training soldiers for combat in the jungle. Much of that is because of the pace of the Japanese offensive. This is one of the second-order effects that we see of such a rapid advance. At the start of conflict, large differences in combat effectiveness aren't unusual. A great example of that is the Wehrmacht in France 1940, where the German army was able to outfight the French army even though it was outnumbered and the French had much better equipment. The French weren't given the time that they required to adapt to the German way of war. The changes that the Australian army would struggle with in the early years of the Southwest Pacific campaign were terrain-based. Either way, it highlights the importance of anticipating the style of warfare that an enemy is going to use. And this can be very difficult, particularly if that enemy hasn't fought for a number of decades and there has been significant technological changes in the intervening period. With that in mind, we'll get back to our interview with Dr. Adrian Threlfall. Adrian, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
So, just thinking back to the fall of Singapore, you've got Lieutenant Colonel Ian Stewart of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, widely regarded as the best battalion commander during the Singapore campaign. Were any of his learnings captured by the Australian Army?
Yep, very, very soon after the fall of Singapore. So 16 February 1942, so the day after the island has fallen, Percival had been intelligent enough to make sure that he was evacuated. So by this day, by the 16th, he's on Java. And obviously elements of 7th Division have arrived on Java also. So a boat is sent to take some British and some Australians from Java and sail them to Ceylon, to Colombo. And while they're on that boat, Major General Tubby Allen and Brigadier Berryman take the opportunity on the 16th to interview Stewart, to basically pick his brain. What has he learnt? What did he think what are the lessons of fighting against the Japanese? Allen and Berryman are so impressed that they say, all right, one day isn't enough. We need to spend a bit more time with you. Those two have to leave, as in Allen and Berryman, they have to leave. They're being ordered back to Australia. So what they do, though, Colonel Elliott, who is Allen's Chief of Staff, and Lieutenant Colonel Wills, who was a senior intelligence officer on General Laverack's HQ, those two are tasked to spend the next 3 days picking the brain of Stewart, getting as much information as they can out of him while they're sailing back on this ship, obviously hoping not to be attacked by Japanese naval aircraft, while they're sailing to Colombo in Ceylon. And what comes out of that, I would call the first really useful documents with regard to fighting in the jungle, living and surviving in the jungle. They become what's the basis for the Army Training Memorandums 7, 8 and 9. So that's February, March and April 1942. All of these are distributed Army-wide, and they come out before Bennett's ATM, so Army Training Memorandum number 10, which comes out in May 1942. I'd use that as evidence that these materials, these documents based on Stewart's interviews, are more useful than what Bennett releases. The other document at the same time is, I mentioned him last week, Colonel Francis Brink, the United States Army Observer. He writes up a document, it's about 29 pages, Tactical Methods 1942. Discussed the Malayan campaign because he'd been an observer during that retreat down the peninsula, but it also included some information from the Philippines and Dutch East Indies. And on the 2nd of March 42, so 2 weeks after the fall of Singapore, Brink's document is distributed by General Wavell, so Allied Forces, Southwest Pacific. He distributes it throughout his area of operation and as well as to India. He argues that it should be used. And within days, the Australian Army does the same. So Chief of General Staff, so Lieutenant General Vernon Sturdy, also releases it. And I'll quote here, he says, "This pamphlet will be studied by all commanders of the Australian Army and by such officers as are responsible for its training." So those two documents, as I said, coming fairly soon after the fall of Singapore, really form the basis of Australian Army training. And I have not looked into it, but if Wavell is correct, and it's those documents are distributed throughout Burma, throughout India, you could argue that its influence moves more broadly than Australia. Those two documents form the basis really for the training that 16 and 17 Brigade undertake on Ceylon between March and July 1942. And it forms a basis of training for Australian units really between April and August 1942 back in Australia. Those are critical. I'd argue they're some of the building blocks or the foundations of more organised training to be disseminated and used across the Australian Army at this early stage. So obviously prior to Kokoda and prior to Milne Bay, they are important.
We've looked at the 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th and discussed their lack of training for the jungle and how that impacted their performance, particularly when compared to the two militia battalions of the 39th and 53rd. How did the independent companies go? Because they were in contact at the same time, but they'd been prepared at the guerrilla warfare camp in Foster. So obviously a little bit colder down in Foster than it would be in New Guinea, but fairly steep in some of those areas and a doctrine that was very different to the traditional Australian Army training at that point. How did they fare?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, sadly, I guess for those who were first deployed, many of them are in the same areas as the bird forces. So places like New Britain, also on the Solomon Islands, on Timor and Ambon, places like that. Even Manus Island, there's a small detachment. I think a couple of platoons are deployed there. So most of them spend the time really just waiting, I guess, for the Japanese invasion to come. So they're deployed in October 1941, so a couple of months before December the 7th. So they spend the time just waiting, really, and then most of them obviously get overrun very, very quickly, or if they're lucky, they manage to evacuate. But you're right, their training at Foster, even though in a bitterly cold conditions on Wilson's Promontory, is in pretty steep and at times pretty ferocious terrain. It's almost jungle. It's not jungle, obviously, as we would understand in the Southwest Pacific sense or even in Queensland, but the scrub is very thick and difficult to get through. They're been established to really follow on from Churchill's idea and the British ideas of commando units either operating behind the lines or doing reconnaissance and raids. So they're not supposed to undertake the same roles as an infantry battalion or a brigade. They're supposed to do long-range patrolling, collecting intelligence, and launching small-scale raids, so to kill, capture, get equipment, get intelligence, things like that. So the raids that they will undertake, so Kanga Force and around sort of the Leh Salamau, that area there. But their training initially is based on British understandings of training. Spencer Chapman, obviously British officer, and others are sent out from the UK to establish these commandos. Obviously, someone in the Australian Army doesn't really like that connotation, so it becomes the independent companies. You're right. At the same time that the Kokoda is happening, so from sort of August 42 through till the end of 1942, elements of the independent companies, the 2nd, 5th and 2nd, 6th, are doing long-range patrolling, sort of not quite flank protection, but it's similar, and collecting intelligence about what the Japanese are doing in New Guinea. they're out for days, weeks, months at a time collecting intelligence, moving through the jungle, living in the jungle. So they're collecting intelligence, but they're also collecting information about what it's like to do this, to live off the land, and how to move through the jungle. At this stage, I don't know whether they're equivalent for the analogy for the SAS, but they're really collecting intelligence, doing overwatch and taking it back. They're not at this stage really launching raids. If they have to fight, they will, but they're more like, I guess, the SAS patrols in the Vietnam War, where they're intelligence gathering and overwatch rather than actually going out there to fight. It's later on where you see the transition to sort of the cavalry commandos, where they are used more as flank protection, but also to launch those raids. So Kayapit, the best example, I guess, of the 2nd, 6th Independent Company launching that assault to capture an airfield to help 7th Division in their advance up the Markham and Ramu valleys in late 43. But in this period, they're more being a reconnaissance units, and they're doing that really effectively. They're patrolling, and as I said, they're learning how to survive in the jungle.
So it wasn't just the Australians who were fighting in that larger area. The United States Marines were fighting at Guadalcanal at this point. What was their preparation like for combat, and how well did they perform?
I think probably similar to the Australians. They're not that really well prepared. There are some of them, people like Chesty Puller, the most famous United States Marine, who are China hands. So there are a number of people at the sort of, I guess, the senior NCO level, gunnery sergeants, gunnery sergeant majors, captains, majors, and a couple of lieutenant colonels like Chesty Puller, who have had multiple years of experience, particularly in China. But the vast majority of them are not experienced. They have not seen combat anywhere. So I think they find combat on Guadalcanal and in the Solomon Islands of a shock also, as the Australians do when they first come into combat with the Japanese. I think one of the few advantages they may have is that, being the United States Marine Corps, they're trained and prepared in amphibious operations, so they're used to littoral operations. They're used to being supplied from landing from ships, having to seize beachheads, or being trained to seize beachheads, and to rely, because the Marine Corps rather than Army, then I guess their initial combat is more ferocious than they were expecting. I have absolutely no doubt about that, but it's a little bit more closely aligned to what they had been trained for than an infantry battalion in the Australian Army had been trained for. And we know that obviously the United States Marine Corps has many decades of experience in all their brushfire wars of sort of Central and South America. And out of this came what the Marines call the Small Wars Manual, which the latest iteration is in 1940. And it's massive, it's 400 pages long, and it contains an awful lot of useful information about how to operate, how to survive, how to move, how to live in jungles, in tropical environments. It's not directly applicable to the combat that they will see in the Southwest Pacific. It certainly never envisages the scale or ferocity of modern warfare, obviously, but I think it provides a really good basis for training, and it certainly was used. I mean, I have not done the research in the American archives. I'd love to find out exactly how assiduously the lessons and information in this manual were applied to training, but they have that there. That doctrine is ready in a digestible form, in a usable form. So I think that certainly helps them. Although, as I said, that the ferocity of that combat and the fact that within days the United States Navy suffers some pretty horrendous setbacks. As for an Australian point of view, we know that the HMAS Canberra is one of those losses, so the Battle of Savo Island, and the United States Navy withdraws its carriers. It decides that it can't afford to lose carriers. They may have destroyers and cruisers and battleships, but they don't have enough carriers. Obviously, they'd lost the Lexington in the Coral Sea. They'd lost Yorktown at Midway. They will eventually go on and lose Hornet in the fighting around Guadalcanal. So there's really that withdrawal of naval support, which is naval air support. So every night, the Japanese come and pound the American positions with naval gunfire. And it's a close-run thing. In August and September 42, when the Australians obviously are fighting desperately over the Kokoda Track, the Marines are fighting just as desperately to defend Henderson Field. I mean, that is the victory. The Japanese know it, that they need to take Henderson Field to have an unsinkable aircraft carrier, an air base on an island. And what becomes Henderson Field is the most useful airfield in the area. And the Americans understand that just as well as the Japanese do, and they need to hold it. And for them, they do.
So we've got lots of elements now that are in contact and they're learning on the job, which isn't the best way of doing it, but they're learning on the job how to operate in the jungle and how to fight the Japanese. How is the lessons learnt collection process developed, and then how is that turned into doctrine? What does that process look like within the Australian Army?
At this period, that first bit is really Stewart's and Brink's interviews, which then become those Australian training memorandum that get distributed army-wide. And basically, you are told as a commanding officer of a unit to use this as the basis for your training. One of the main problems with training is the decentralised nature of it. Obviously, pre-war, it's on a region basis, so military regions. And even once you get into the war, training is really up to divisional and then brigade and then battalion and even down to, at some stages, company or platoon levels. So it really devolved too far down. There is no centralised training. That's one of the benefits that the AIF units that serve in the Middle East have. They go to the British school, the Middle East Training School. So lots of our people at the level of captains, majors and lieutenant colonels have the benefit of going to that training school and then taking those learnings back to their units. There isn't at this stage an equivalent in Australia, particularly not for jungle conditions. So reports, after action reports are coming in. One of the things I find most frustrating is that lessons are learnt several times and reports are written up and sent back to Australia, to our HQ, and once the DMT is created, the Director of Military Training, but not passed on. So the best example I can give of this is in February and March and April 1941, 8th Division creates, at their unit level, they create documents and diagrams of how to patrol in the jungle and how to undertake immediate action drills. And they can include little diagrams also of stalker courses, what they call stalker courses. So close range engagement, so walking through the jungle with your rifle, targets popping up, and you've got to, your individual soldier has to engage them. So that happens in, as I said, early 41 with 8th Div. It then happens again with 6th Div training on Ceylon. So in the ones I can think of is April 1942. Same things, almost identical little diagrams, plans. This is how we should do immediate action drills, how we should move through the jungle. Then in May and June 42, same things happening, being created. These are all independently, being created by 7 Div, doing their training in Australia. So by this stage, by May, June, July 42, they're up in northern New South Wales and just over the border in southern Queensland. And they're doing the same thing. You can find them in these files, in these unit war diaries. They've got diagrams of how a platoon and how sections should move through the jungle, and also separate diagrams for how to create these jungle stalker courses, which is what most of them call them. So on 3 separate occasions over basically 18 months, exactly the same lessons have been learnt, have been recorded, have been digested, have been disseminated amongst those units, sent back to Australia, and they've just gathered dust. They've not gone anywhere. So that's the best example, I think, of the fact that there is no central repository for all these documents to come to. And if there is, then there is nobody actually reading through these and going, aha, we've learnt that lesson there, or they suggested this lesson back here 18 months ago. If 3 people or 3 different units have independently suggested that this might be the way to go, there needed to be a light bulb moment. But until Canungra is set up, there's the 4th instance. So even if everything's being collated, it's not being read through. And the Directorate of Military Training, their history, which they publish they create in September 45, it actually admits that in this period, the DMT consisted of 2 officers, a captain and a lieutenant whose task was basically admin. So you can't be, as I said, that's impossible. 2 officers would find it completely and utterly impossible to look at all these reports that are coming in. And you need to sort through the unit war diaries. And obviously that's thousands of pages in itself. But in those unit war diaries, there's all these wonderful gems about how to train, how to move in the jungle, what to do, what weapons to use, what uniforms to use. But as you said earlier, it's reactionary. There isn't the time, I guess, to go through every unit war diary from every month from these units and look at the learnings that they have written down and the diagrams they've created, the suggestions they've made. There just isn't the staff. There are not the staff available at the DMT in order to satisfactorily go through and pick out those lessons.
Do we know why that was? Because obviously the war was going fairly badly. Like, you don't need to be a grand strategist to be able to work out that the Japanese really are rampaging through the AO on all fronts. What was it that held back Army from wanting to collate all of these little gems of information and then synthesizing it and getting it out into the hands of the soldiers as quickly as possible?
At the simplest level, it is about the fact that staff officers, so permanent Army, staff officers pre-war, they are sent out to units, and the units back home in Australia are denuded of their good officers. They are all sent to the Middle East in late 39, 40, 41. By 42, these officers are, in the Middle East. They're serving with 6th, 7th and 9th Divisions because they can handle the staff officer duties. They've been through those staff colleges. They've been through RMC. And there's nobody left. They're really scraping the bottom of the barrel. There were more. At the start of the war, DMT had more officers, but gradually over the course of the war, they were sent to the Middle East, detached to serve with those 3 divisions over there, and at headquarters, Australian Army headquarters in the Middle East. So working with Blaney's, that's what they're doing. So by the time we get to mid-42, there's virtually nobody left. As I said, there's these two poor officers having to work frantically by themselves until it starts to change, but it really isn't until Canungra starts to be established, so sort of October, November 42, that things start to change. And then LHQ also changes once they decide that they need to set up their training teams. But in that earlier period up till, I said, July or August 42, the manpower just is not there to go through, to sort through all of these documents because the demand has been for officers, for trained staff officers to serve in the Middle East. And that hasn't. Some of them are starting to come back, but it hasn't happened in sufficient numbers.
So given the fact that Army didn't have a centralised place until later in the war, what sort of informal knowledge sharing there was? Sort of, between units, brigades, divisions, and then across armies. So what sort of cross-pollination was there between the American Army as they were fighting, at the Battle of the Beaches and in Guadalcanal, Australia? And we know that Slim rated the Australian victory at Milne Bay very highly because that was the first time that the Japanese had been decisively beaten. And I think he looked at that as an example from a morale point of view, and he spoke about the effect that had on his troops. And then he requested, I think it was 100 officers to come across and help train his troops. What sort of happened at the informal level?
Yeah, it's certainly happening. With the frustration, I guess, of these units doing their training, whether it's, we'll keep 8th Division aside because obviously they are eventually all captured and go in the bag. But for 6th Div training on Ceylon and then 6th and 7th Div training in Australia in the middle of 1942, there is, to an extent, an exchange of information with militia units and with Australian-based units. But a lot of the emphasis in this period is on preparing defences of the Australian mainland for a Japanese amphibious invasion, particularly in the north of Australia, so sort of the Brisbane Line fear. So 6th and 7th Div, while they're doing their training, they're also having to help dig ditches, prepare roads, prepare defences on the Queensland, southern Queensland coast and northern New South Wales coast. Some militia units are being able to foster in, so men coming across, being sent across to serve, to do their training with the Australians. But obviously, if this is 6th and 7th Div, they haven't seen combat against the Japanese yet. They've done some training on Ceylon, on Sri Lanka, or they've done some training themselves, as I said, in northern New South Wales and in southern Queensland. But this is before the establishment of Canungra. So it is really at that informal level, frantically going around. Obviously, militia units are still being created or having men marched in, because obviously there is conscription at this stage, because you can do that for the defence of Australia. So there are men who just need to get basic training. And it's, again, as I mentioned before, it's on a military region basis. So the 1st Australian Recruit Training Centre isn't set up in Cowra. So that's in Cowra, not Kapooka. People think of Kapooka, obviously. That is set up But Cowra's not set up until it's April 1943, and that becomes the recruit training centre for both CMF and AIF soldiers. And once you've got those sort of centralised training centres, you can obviously ensure that your instructors, and therefore the people they're going to train, are going to be singing from the same hymn sheet, going to be using the same training. But before that, we're doing what we think best. As I said, we're using Stewart's ATMs 7, 8 and 9. We're using Brink's tactical methods. But it's until Canungra is established, so October and November 42, and then with the Recruit Training Centre established in early 43, before we start to get that really centralised focus and centralised training. So before then, maybe it's not informal, but it's unit to unit. It's, say, the battalions of 21 Brigade saying, all right, what worked for you guys? Well, what did you do? How do your platoons move through the jungle? And this is how, in this period of training, they realised that the infantry training manual that had been created in the Middle East, at the simplest level, you need to basically flip the 2 up, 1 back. So obviously in the Middle East, you would have 2 of your platoon, for a company, you'd have 2 of your platoons forward and one withdrawn. One withdrawn was where the CO would be, the company commander and comms. Whereas in the jungle, it's either got to be single file or it's got to be arrowhead, as in one section or one platoon forward and the others back. And obviously you need to be able to have Bren guns on both flanks because you don't know when you're going to stumble upon the enemy in that really thick jungle terrain. So those lessons are being learnt and passed around across battalions, across brigades. That is moving up through. The chain of command is working within a unit and within formations, most definitely. That chain of information and learning is going through from platoon to company, up to battalion, being sent up to brigade, up to 7th Division with Alan in charge. They're singing from the same hymn sheet, definitely. But when it gets up to Army, that's where the block is. Because, as I said, LHQ is swamped and is looking at the strategic level. DMT, Director of Military Training, has no officers and can't really digest the wealth of material that's coming in. Yeah, so each of those units is prepared differently or preparing differently until... I don't think things are really working properly, not until the middle of 1943. Once you take in all the lessons of Milne Bay, Yokota campaign and the Beachhead campaigns, and is able to take a breath, because obviously the next AIF campaigns are not until September, October, November 1943, when we get Ley, Salamaua, Finchhaven, Sattelberg, so 7th and 9th Divisions. So there's an interregnum period between late February 43 and September 43, when that is the key moment, or that's the key period of bringing everything together, bringing all those lessons together and creating the doctrine, the training centres, the LHQ training teams, and then towards the end of that period, the jungle scale divisions.
We'll leave the interview there. Next week, we will return with Adrian telling us about a key development on the road to mastery of jungle combat for the Australian Army, and that is the founding of the Jungle Warfare Centre at Canungra. And just a gentle reminder, if you have got anything out of this episode, please leave a review on your favourite podcast player. It really does help get the word out about the podcast.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.